So this is our pre-reading lecture for our chapter by Adam Green, Making the Music. So what I wanted to do with this pre-reading lecture is to give us a little bit of social context about the Great Migration in the United States, which is one of the precipitating factors for the rise of these cultural centers such as Bronzeville in Chicago, Harlem in Chicago, that become centers for arts and culture in the United States after the Second World War. So in order to talk about the Great Migration, we have to kind of jump back in our time machine and talk a little bit about this era that's referred to as Reconstruction. Okay, so as we are probably familiar with, the close of the Civil War in 1865, there is a lot of work to do in terms of literally rebuilding the country and then making the country whole again in terms of participation, in terms of emancipation, in terms of the recreation of civil society, now that we have a nation that is united once again. So what we see happening is this growth in a series of constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that are oriented around the emancipation of formerly enslaved individuals, equal protection under the law, and access to the right to vote, right? So all of these aspects are being federally guaranteed during this period that is referred to as Reconstruction. So it's an era that's marked by action on the federal level, right? So civil rights protection is being guaranteed through the letter of the law with these amendments and with the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as well. Okay, so what we see happening here is essentially creating a set of legislative backbone for creating the opportunity for the full and fair participation of newly emancipated African American individuals in the rights and privileges of citizenship, right? So we see African Americans exercising their right to vote for the first time, and we see African Americans elected to state and federal office, and go about building political community as well. And so when we're thinking about this era that's happening under President Grant, we're thinking about this idea of a kind of opening of public life, right? So if we're thinking about Reconstruction in the period that follows, it's kind of like finally the door is kind of edging open in terms of guaranteeing the rights of citizenship to African Americans living in the United States. Okay, so as we might imagine, the folks that had waged an entire war in defense of the institution of slavery, they are not excited about the increased political visibility and participation of newly emancipated African Americans. So what we see happening is that the Southern electorate rebels against President Grant and throws their support behind President Hayes. And so we see this, and we'll talk about this in a moment, also reflected in a very extreme backlash on the part of former slave owners and Southern whites who are seeing a system of white supremacy from which they had benefited changing before their eyes during this era of Reconstruction. Okay, so back to President Hayes. So Hayes is elected, but it's a really close election, and it's disputed as well. So what we see happening is that Southern Democrats are refusing to acknowledge his electoral win unless he agrees to end Reconstruction, unless he agrees to put an end to this expansion of the political and social rights of newly emancipated African Americans. And so Hayes, being a person who wants to be president, says, okay, I will end Reconstruction. So he gives in to this backroom political threat, essentially, and says, yeah, I'm going to end Reconstruction because I want to become president. So it's a pretty lame move, to say the very least, and this is a move that irrevocably changes the course of American history, because what happens when Reconstruction ends is that essentially means that home rule, right, the rule of these individual states, is put it back into place. So that means that federal troops who were protecting African American individuals from harassment on their way to open businesses, on their way to vote, on their way to participate in these newly accessible rights as citizens, right? These federal troops are gone, right? They're gone from the South, and what we see is that the power of the states to determine their own sets of laws and practices is growing during this era. So this is where we get that kind of idea of states' rights sort of emerging in the wake of President Hayes putting an end to Reconstruction. So in 1883, we also see a blow to this guarantee of civil rights for newly emancipated African Americans with the 1883 decision by the Supreme Court stating that the Civil Rights Act is unconstitutional. And they declared it to be unconstitutional because it's declared to be an overreach, that it denies the rights of states to create their own laws governing social and civic life in their states. Okay, so this is a quote from an activist, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, from the year that the Supreme Court came to its decision. The world has never witnessed such barbarous laws entailed upon a free people as have grown out of the decision of the United States Supreme Court issued October 15th, 1883. For that decision alone authorized and now sustains all the unjust discriminations, proscriptions, and robberies perpetrated by public carriers upon the millions of the nation's most loyal defenders. It fathers in all the Jim Crow cars into existence, into which colored people are huddled and compelled to pay as much as the whites who are given the finest accommodations. It has made the ballot of the black man a parody, his citizenship a nullity, and his freedom a burlesque. It has engendered the bitterest feelings between the whites and blacks, and resulted in the death of thousands who would have been living and enjoying life today. So Turner is describing three different things, right? On the one hand, he's describing segregation happening in public transportation and other public institutions. He's also describing the way that disenfranchisement, making the ballot of the black man a parody, becomes part of this post-Reconstruction life in the South. And then third, we're seeing the way that he's describing this idea that the freedom of the African-American individual becomes a joke, a burlesque, right? And he's also describing, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, this results in a culture of violence and a culture of domestic terror in the American South for newly emancipated African Americans attempting to live their lives. Okay, so we are probably familiar with this concept of the Jim Crow South, and the reason I wanted to sort of spend time talking about Reconstruction is that we can think about, as I mentioned before, right, Reconstruction sort of began to inch the door open in terms of free and fair participation in the goods of democracy for African American citizens, and the end of Reconstruction slams that door shut and, in fact, right, builds a giant barricade towards ever opening that door again, to continue the metaphor. Okay, so the Jim Crow South is a set of formal codified systems that enforce racial segregation, and they begin to be developed as soon as Reconstruction ends, so starting in the 1880s, and they persist until the 1960s when we see the 20th century civil rights movement making progress in terms of dismantling this system of segregation. Okay, so it impacted every single aspect of everyday life, as we're probably familiar with: schools, libraries, bathrooms, restaurants, public transit, literally everything. These are a few examples of laws to just give us a sense of what this means, right? And these are laws that are literally written down in the codes of different states or local municipalities. You can't play checkers with someone of a different race. You cannot marry a person of a different race. Schools that we're probably familiar with, and then public transit, right? So these are some examples for the minutia that is included in the creation of this very strict form of racial segregation that becomes codified in this era starting in 1883 and spanning into the 20th century. Okay, so what we see happening in 1896 is that these laws that we just looked at, for example, on the previous slide, are declared to be constitutionally sound with this 1896 decision that's referred to as Plessy versus Ferguson. We may have heard this phrase before. And this is the decision that puts forward this idea of separate but equal, right? This is the kind of the fiction around which segregation is justified. This idea that we'll create separate schools, separate everything in order to enforce the segregation, because the very idea of the races mixing is so, inflammatory to a white power structure, right? Is so inflammatory to, people who have enjoyed generations of privilege and power. Okay, so what happens is that, right, with discrimination and segregation becoming essentially legal, through Plessy versus Ferguson, we begin to see that this kind of enforcement of segregation is not enough for the kind of closing in of and the kind of closing of ranks in terms of political power for white Southerners as well. So what we see happening is this desire to remove access to the right to vote for African Americans as well. So there are many, many, many different ways that Southern states worked to disenfranchise African American voters. These are just a few of the examples that an African American voter would face upon heading to the polling place. So there would be invented laws, such as the Grandfather Clause, that says that you can only vote if your ancestors voted before the Civil War. Okay, we can know the obvious problems with that one. Sometimes there would be a poll tax that was extracted only from African American citizens, not white Americans, in order to gain access to the right to vote. We know that is super illegal, but was super happening. Or we also see these literacy tests that say, okay, you can vote if you can name every single vice president and every single Supreme Court justice throughout history. I couldn't do that. No one can really do that, right? So the sense of the creation of these more and more elaborate ways of creating greater and more dangerous obstacles for individuals to exert their political power at the ballot box, right? So this desire to have a stranglehold on power is reflected in both the development and legality of segregation as a social system, but then also through stripping away of the right to vote. Okay. So this is a quote that I really like from a book that I highly recommend that kind of describes this sense of the door being sort of battened down, being hammered shut. Every year, people who'd been able to vote or ride the train where they chose found something they could do freely yesterday they were prohibited from doing today. They were losing ground and sinking in status with each passing day. And well into the new century, the color codes would only grow to encompass more activities of daily life as quickly as legislators could divide them. So I love the way Wilkerson kind of describes this kind of chipping away of the ability to engage in the full rights of a citizen, this chipping away of your ability to engage in the use of public resources and public space in a safe fashion, right? This idea that, right, each day there was less available to you. Each day there were less things you could use safely. Each day there was less opportunity for you in remaining in these states that would create these obstacles, create these laws in order to legislate, in order to maintain a white power structure. Okay, so one of the other things that Turner mentioned in the quote we looked at earlier is this fact that this creation of all these laws and this creation of a kind of legal standing for a system of segregation is also results in the creation of a social environment that is best characterized as domestic terror, right? So what we see happening here is that alongside the stuff that's written down in the codes for the Jim Crow South, we also see this development of this informal etiquette that governed every single social interaction between individuals in the South, right? So this idea of deferring to whites in all disputes, right? Having to use the word sir or ma'am, etc. All of these really demeaning forms of socialization that are meant to enforce this power structure or this hierarchy as well. And so if someone thought that you stepped out of line because you didn't say ma'am or you didn't say sir, or you looked at someone the wrong way, you could be kidnapped in broad daylight and murdered, and there would be literally no legal recourse for you or your family, right? So this vigilante justice context develops in the form of lynch mobs that had either the kind of like deferential support of local law enforcement or the look the other way support of law enforcement. So these conditions of domestic terror emerged in the Jim Crow South throughout the 20th century. Okay. And I'll share a link with you all that tells the story of Emmett Till that we may be familiar with, a child from Chicago who was visiting relatives in the South and was kidnapped and brutally murdered, and no legal recourse came about. So I'll share an NPR story about that. Sorry, I need to plug in my computer, so I'll make a part 2 in a moment. Give me 1 second.